Let's get some facts. 37% of you aren't subscribed to this channel. That's almost 4 out of 10 just freeloading the alpha. So come on, hit subscribe and I promise to keep leveling up the show with the best guests and the juiciest insight. Go on, do it now.
Hi everyone, we are here at Breakpoint 2025 in Abu Dhabi and we have a great conversation for you coming up. I'm joined by Yat Siu, co-founder of Animoca. Yat Siu, how are you doing today? Thank you for joining us.
I'm great. I mean, here at Solana Breakpoint, every time we're here at a conference, it's hard not to feel bullish and excited. It's like, you might feel down about the market, then you go to a conference and you're like, let's go. That's kind of how I feel right now.
Yeah, absolutely. The energy is just so contagious.
It's electric.
Yeah. Don't look at the price, right?
Fundamentals.
Yeah. But, come on, start high level with you. We're closing up on 2025. Yeah. What are your kind of expectations for crypto going into 2026 and maybe even beyond?
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously this year I would say it was a bit of a flat year, shall we say, if you think about it, right? Started off actually, thematically strong, but actually ended up being quite damaging in the first quarter, if you remember, with, Trump and Melania token and that kind of stuff. And then basically Q2, Q3, good recovery. Everyone was hoping for a nice sort of finish for Q4. The predictions, Bitcoin 150, maybe 200K. Didn't quite happen. We think it's more going to be deferred over the next year. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But I think the big lesson that I think people should be mindful of, and I think that's where we went a little bit off in 25, is that while Trump, and I think Trump is the, if there was a man of the year for crypto, I think I would give it to Trump, both in the good and the bad side, right? And I was just talking about this to someone else and I was like, what would be the rating? B minus, C plus, but I think everyone thought that with Trump coming in and with all the things that we've done, it should be A plus plus plus, right?
Yeah.
And I think we went in with this mindset, and a lot of people basically became a little bit more sort of reckless and a little bit more risk on because they were hoping and believing so much in Trump. And I think we need to face the reality that, he's been great for crypto on the policy side. He's supportive, families are supported. Don't get me wrong, right? It's very important. However, crypto is ultimately still a sideshow for Trump, in a sense, right? And by that, I mean that he wants America to be the crypto capital, but other things are more important, right? Basically, jobs, employment, economy, trade war with China, yes, no, there's a situation that's going on in, Ukraine and Russia, like whatever these things are, the tariffs, all that kind of stuff, that's more important to him than basically what's happening in the world of crypto. And I think when you look at X and you look at some of those conversations, I think in our own little bubble, we felt more like Trump is here. He's going to save us. He's going to make the industry great. And I think we basically took more risk than we should have. So the theme to me for 26 is going to be essentially eyes wide open, right? We're still going to be positive. Clarity Act will be incredibly bullish for the industry, right? I think it's going to be great for altcoins. I think there's been an explosion of tokenization as a result of that, right? However, Trump remains an X factor, right? And basically just be prepared for the fact that, he's not the number one priority and, life goes on, right? And we just have to basically manage that sort of that risk angle, right? But I also think, as we've seen this year and the year before, institutional adoption and institutional support for crypto is going to rise ever more. RWAs, stable coins, all these things are going to be important thematics. We're going to get more institutional capital coming in as a result. There's a lot of public companies going public as well next year. I mean, people talk about Kraken. Ourselves, we made an announcement of going, and basically with a reverse merger with Currency Group, right? So all of these things are happening. So next year will be a very strong institutional year and we'll continue to have that. And which means to me that the other thing to look at is what are the tokens in the space that are going to be institutionally ready? Because we don't think it's going to be as much retail as a lot of what was driven before, where people are trading. I think it's going much more about who are people who are going to buy tokens for the long haul and believe in it in the long term, because I think there's something fundamentally strong about this, not just in the form of, digital asset treasuries, which has kind of had a little bit of a sort of a experience, shall we say, this year, but also in relation to projects themselves who can now talk about fundamentals of the token. If we're in Solana. Solana is famous for originally meme coins, right? Why was meme coins created? Because of the SEC saying, hey, we don't like, you can't talk about utility. You can't talk about anything. So I launched a token. It's a joke, but in secret, I'm building a utility. And of course, then it gets mixed in with fundamentally good projects and really projects that really had no fundamentals and really were never trying to deliver any real value, right? And now, under this new administration and basically hopefully with the passing of Clarity Act, we can now actually translate the value directly. I think people should know that there are companies in crypto, including ourselves, who are profitable, who are printing EBITDA, who are basically doing, nine-figure revenues, or in some cases less or more. But point is, fundamentally good companies, but could not talk about how they could translate the value of their earnings or income or whatever they're building into the token, because we weren't allowed to. And I believe next year that will change. So I think look out for that. And I think we're going to get to much more fundamentals in 26, which I think is exciting, going forward.
Yeah, there's so many threads we can pull on right there, but I want to kind of stick with the institution, and I want to talk to you about your IPO, because that's a huge deal. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and kind of what that process looks like?
Yeah, so we announced a reverse merger with the Currency Group, NASDAQ, sort of ticker CURR. Of course, on closing of that actual transaction, we'll probably have a new ticker. We don't know what that is yet. We'll let you know. Probably something related to Animoca, but not sure yet, right? It's a reverse merger, which is a little bit different than a SPAC or sort of a reverse takeover, because we're actually buying a company, but because in NASDAQ, essentially it's sort of reverse merging into us, but on a 95-5 ratio. What that means is essentially that the Currency Group, which is basically listed on NASDAQ, those shareholders will have 5% and we'll have 95%. So essentially diluting them by 95% on the new share issuance. And that way you can kind of get an implied share price already today. That's what some people are doing, right? Currency Group itself is actually a fintech company. So they already service something like 30 million customers. And when you're basically doing micropayments, and actually, interestingly enough, one of the subsidiaries has a business relationship with Ripple. So this is actually a crypto business. So it fits very well with what we're building and is actually quite strategic. So, I sometimes half joke about this, but like, hey, don't dismiss the target, right? Because a lot of times people look at the target and they say, it's a shell, it doesn't matter. No, this particular target is actually tactical. They've got a wallet business. They've got sort of an AI sort of investing business. So it's kind of interesting stuff that we could actually integrate together and then combine that, hopefully build it into this sort of major powerhouse. Now, why do we choose to go public? Is because we think Animoca Brands will be the best index and alternative sort of, the ultimate levered bet on altcoins, right? And it comes from our thesis, right? Not just because of our portfolio, which is over 620 companies and growing, that altcoins is going to be collectively larger than Bitcoin. And this is really the analogy to me is gold versus the stock market. Gold is $27 trillion. Stock market is $128 trillion. Add the private markets, that's another $100 trillion. Why is the stock market collectively larger than gold? Because that's what we use. We use Google, we use Apple, we use Facebook, we use all these companies, right? Big and small. And that's what altcoins is for crypto, right? I mean, we use Solana. We use it for the tokens that gain entry to the ecosystem. We use it for gas fees, right? We use game tokens, whether it's sand tokens or across the ages or check or whatever, to play a game. We use it for DeFi. We use it for DePIN. So actually, how is crypto growing? Through altcoins, right? And so altcoins today, however, is half the value of Bitcoin, right? And so from our sort of perspective, if you are going to want to, be invested in crypto, and if you believe, as we do, that crypto in the mid to long term will be at least $100 trillion asset class, then how can you not have exposure to altcoins, right? And that's Animoca, right? We think that's the way to do it. And the other thing is that we think that the industry today is at roughly where the internet was in 2000, 2001, right? Which kind of, some people might say that makes sense. But either way, we are at a stage where, the Amazon, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world are all being created at this moment in time. Now, if you were a fund, you would basically invest in a fund and you might do well, but you'd have to liquidate in 10 years. That means imagine if you got out of, investing in Google or Facebook or Apple, back in the 2000s and you got out in 2011, 2012. You would have made money, but you would have missed out a lot of the upside, right? And so through a vehicle like Animoca Brands, where we invest out of the balance sheet, you can exposure this in long term. And because it's public, you can trade out of it if you like, right? And of course, we also have, with companies like Republic on Solana are basically tokenizing our shares, which means that you can also have exposure to the business by buying tokens, right? So it's kind of just, if you think about it, what is crypto? It's about democratizing access to these financial vehicles. If I wanted to invest in those amazing companies at the early stages, I have to invest in a fund. Is the fund going to take your money? Maybe if you have $10 million or $50 million, and if you're famous or well-known or important, but if you're not, how do you get access? And again, a public vehicle solves that, right? And if you don't like it, you can trade out, right? That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, I just love the perspective that you put it in gold versus the stock market, Bitcoin versus altcoins. That makes me still think, you hear people saying, oh, it's kind of, we're past the point of being early, but it makes me still think like we are early and we have so much more to go.
So, yesterday we had an event with Sharuk, which we co-hosted with Mocha Network. basically, which is identity chain. And I would say there was probably, and this is not to sort of toot my own horn or anything, but within crypto, people generally know who I am. But at that event, I would say half of the people were like, nice to meet you. Who are you? Right. And I'm like, that's great, because it just tells me that we are so early still and people don't know me. And I like that, because then I have to introduce myself and explain. It's not that I want to introduce myself, but the point is that I have to explain what we do, and then what is altcoins, and why is that important, and who's Animoca, right? And the fact that we do this is actually just indicative of the fact that there's just still so much more to go. And so we are definitely early.
Yeah. Oh my God. That's great to hear. And it also gives you that opportunity to just educate and onboard new people that haven't thought about it before, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to kind of go back to what you were talking about with Trump and, kind of trying to make, US the center of, crypto, right?
Yes.
And in this conversation, and even today in the conversations that I've been having, it's been very US focused, right? But this is way more outside of the US that's happening in crypto. So, and right here, we're in the Middle East, this is just so exciting. They're moving at a rapid speed. What excites you about this region when it comes to crypto?
Well, I mean, I think we have to first appreciate the fact that this region was willing to sort of shine a light on basically very dark times, right? Now think about it. Post FTX, basically pretty much every country around the world was like basically retreating from crypto in like literally light speed. But basically Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Hong Kong actually embraced it. And, I think now as a result, you see the outcome. It was the right decision. Think about what we're seeing here in the event. All these builders, all these developers. We have over 600 portfolio companies, and we probably have at least 50 or 60 of them in this region, if not more. But it's not because they are originally from here. They moved here, right? And that's exactly why we need to be here as well. Most recently, we got in principle approval basically from Abu Dhabi for license here, also from Bara, right? So we're basically very, very committed here. So, and I think the other thing is, what is crypto ultimately? In many ways, it's the asset class of the youth, right? Young people get it, right? If you look at, for instance, South Korea, there are a couple other reasons, but, a very popular stat is that something like 60% of the youth under the age of 30 almost exclusively trade crypto, right? And so, from that vantage point, actually, if it's the asset class of the youth, that means that any place where there's young people, crypto will grow. And guess where most of the youth is? This region, right? Actually, right? And, I think there is somewhat of an analogy when you look at places like Europe. And I know everyone loves to bash Europe, but sometimes they deserve it, right? Which is that, Europe is conservative, but it's also generally inverted in terms of, the sort of, replacement rates. There's basically, very young, not a lot of young people comparatively people to older people. So more conservatism, less adoption on crypto as a result of that, less interest in it, right? And you see this basically affecting, basically the adoption there. Whereas here, you have a lot of adoption, right? I mean, children love gaming and they love crypto.
Yeah, and absolutely. It's kind of speaking of young people, gaming and crypto. One thing that, Animoca, that I've seen, you guys have really been at the forefront of, NFTs and supporting creators. And, in 2021, I think we saw NFTs first come to market, and we had these grand visions of what they would be, and people started speculating wildly. And today, it's a little bit different, right? So how has your kind of thinking evolved on NFTs from, then to now?
I mean, NFTs still remain basically the ultimate store of digital culture, right? If you look at CryptoPunks, in some ways, I would say investing in CryptoPunk was probably a better levered play on Ethereum than Ethereum itself, right? Or even a DAT, if there would have been one at the time. But of course, from a status standpoint, I mean, I think it exists. NFTs are still a $300 to $400 million per monthly sales sort of volume. So it's actually a meaningful size. It's just that most people, if you're not in NFTs or if you're not in crypto, you don't see that. So and the hype is kind of gone, right? But actually, the fundamental aspect of basically NFTs remains, right? I mean, the Bored Ape is still 6-7 ETH, per Bored Ape. Pudgy Penguin is roughly the same, give or take, depending what day you look at, right? And they've become essentially the Veblen status goods, basically of the digital industry. But, there are a couple of things that we need to sort of, I guess, appreciate a little bit where NFTs have gone. And for instance, like in gaming, NFTs in games, we made some mistakes back in the early days, not really understanding what GameFi meant, for instance, right? Which we're very bullish on. But instead of thinking that we're going to take a Web2 game and basically slap a sort of, Web3 interface on it, basically skins like NFTs and virtual currency like tokens, actually GameFi should be thought of more in terms of the gamification of finance. right? And what I mean by that is essentially, and that's kind of what NFTs did in a way. NFTs, of course, they are these status goods, but what made them fun was essentially by trading them, you actually basically created fun in the finance aspect of these digital objects as well. And the people who traded them as much for money and value as they did for fun.
Right.
And the insight on this was that when you think about Gen Z and how they trade, whether it's, prediction markets or whether it's tokens, for instance, it's fun. It's entertaining. But, my parents don't trade for fun. Most professional traders don't trade for fun, right? They close the book at the end of the thing. They don't think it's entertaining. They think it's about making money. It could be stressful. And maybe there is stress involved, but the trading is the game in and of itself, right? And I think Gen Z thinks of it as much more exciting that way. And it's kind of like people playing sort of fun poker, but it's kind of people playing in China. It's like mahjong or betting on horses. How many people bet on horse races, for fun? Right? They don't actually, it's the thrill, it's excitement, it's the calculation and that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not actually, you're not there to make money from it per se. You're just having fun, right? And I think that's the perspective that Gen Z takes with it. And this translation you see in companies like eToro and Robinhood. They've got leaderboards, they've got social status, they've got social rankings, right? It's basically gamifying it, right? So I think the intersection of that and NFTs is an expression of gaming culture, which is what we all grew up with, and translating that into the world of finance and collectibles and assets.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned prediction markets in that, because those are absolutely blowing up. And the way I kind of look at it is you're essentially gamifying life and just everyday activities.
And sentiment, right?
Yeah.
And you can analyze that. And I can foresee a future where, how do you hedge against an election? Well, I guess prediction markets might be one way to do that, right? Your business might be heavily impacted by this particular person being voted. Well, you didn't hedge yourself. Maybe you basically sort of trade the other way, right? I mean, there's all sorts of interesting analogies that you can build from there.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, sentiment, we saw from the election, that was way more accurate than any of the polls that came out about, who is going to win.
And that's because there's something at stake, right? And also it's real time. That's the other thing. Whenever you make a vote on something, you actually only get the vote of that snapshot in time, right? Which is not very accurate because we're living in a time where essentially decisions and changes happen literally in real time. So if I took that poll 1 week ago, it may be completely irrelevant, right? Because sentiment have changed. Someone said something altered in the space, whatever happened. So the real time aspect of these prediction markets are also actually highly, highly valuable.
Yeah. And, kind of talked about NFTs and prediction markets, especially blowing up now. Another thing that's been just absolutely going wild is AI, right? And you've talked about tokenization and AI. I want to ask you, how do you see those two kind of working in tandem together?
I don't think we have enough time to go talk about all of that, right? But I mean, I think there's a few very basic ways to think about that. I talked about how I think crypto is basically the natural hedge towards AI because it's the asset class of AI, right? If I want to be able to trade between basically AI agents that are working 24/7, I will need to do this in a sovereign way. And that needs to be done in a sort of something that is permissionless, trustless, and immutable. So I'm more than willing to trade between other agents in something like Solana, or Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever token, because I know it's actually mine, right? If I do it through a centralized platform, they can shut you off. They can take, so I might be willing to do thousands of dollars of business this way, but if I suddenly have millions of dollars on the line, it's way too risky. Think about all the companies that got deplatformed, even on X, because X or Facebook or Google said, we don't like what you do. Hit delete button. That happened to us basically on the App Store when we were having games. Apple didn't like us back in 2012 and deleted all of our apps, but basically almost killed our entire business and never really gave us a reason because we're basically building on that particular platform. But the other way that I think we can think about this is really that tokens, particularly when they talk about AI, are basically the digital commodities that represent energy and compute, right? So think about how we operate today in the real world. Because you can trade and have futures and markets for lithium and cobalt and all the materials that we use to basically make electronics, so on, you actually have a deeper, better market for basically the production of these areas because I can finance it. I can basically sort of hedge it. I can do all sorts of stuff. And you have basically a better market because of the fact that this commodity is tradable as well on top of the production of it. Well, that's basically what we can do with tokens. Right now, we're already spending tokens essentially inside AI. It's of course a closed loop token, but imagine if that token was tradable, right? And then it actually was, an open token ecosystem and traded like a commodity. Then you can see all the same benefits emerge from that. And then actually, if I wanted to have a hedge or I wanted to be invested in the AI industry without owning a share in OpenAI, for instance, or open a share in Anthropic, maybe just buying the token in that commodity or hedging against it, or having perps or futures or whatever is actually one way in which you basically manage the risk of that industry, right? Right now, we're looking at it from a company perspective, but that's a very, very poor indicator, right? Because actually the company, is basically making profits from that, but the usage and the utility and the commodity of the digital commodity that's used there is actually all in the form of tokens, right? And that should be tradable and open and then becomes richer as an ecosystem. And I think the AI company that will ultimately tokenize themselves with this sort of approach is going to win against the company that doesn't tokenize, because you have much deeper and more powerful markets because of the fact that there's a token that's trading in the open market.
So much we can go with there, but you're right. We don't have enough time to go down that rabbit hole. I want to ask you though, because, we're here at Breakpoint, right? And obviously Solana's the talk, right? So why is Solana so interesting, from maybe an institutional side and, just for an everyday, user? Why is Solana an interesting, protocol?
Well, I think what Solana has done really, really well, especially post the FTX thing, it's gotten a lot of institutional adoption. In many ways, the FTX sale, sort of the sale of the Solana estate that went to a lot of institutions, basically kind of became a marketing tool for institutions because they sold it. And in fact, we ended up buying sort of a portion of Solana tokens from that estate sale. And that's how we actually got a bigger stake on it than we did from the open market, because back in the day when it was touted in 22. It seemed expensive relative at the time. We didn't really know where it was going. And then when, actually Galaxy was basically out there, offering to sell it, we were one of the buyers of it as well. And we got exposure to it. And we and many other much bigger institutions basically got exposure to that. I think that's part of that. But of course, communication and the fact in this particular case, there is something to be said about sort of the monolithic structure of Solana as essentially a single ecosystem, a single foundation led by essentially a top-down approach, really in many ways, right? Basically was helpful to communicate and unify that message. And I think when you compare it to Ethereum, which we are bullish on, but with Ethereum, which is actually in the many sense more decentralized, fragmented amongst its L2s, right? Which I do believe in, right? I don't think it's one or the other. I think there are arguments to be both ways. So I think both ecosystems will succeed. But because of that, you have less unity around it, right? I think of Ethereum much more federated in its approach, right? Which means that the way in which you create essentially unity is harder. But on the other hand, you'll have breakout successes in some of these L2s that then ultimately will benefit the L1 over the longer run. Whereas with, Solana, the whole network effects are bridged into one particular ecosystem. The challenge with that, though, is that something that happens in that ecosystem can impact the rest of the ecosystem as well. That may not be related to what you do. There's pros and cons around that, right? But I think this unified, I wouldn't say it's centralized. It's not decentralized as an institution, but this sort of top-down, basically communication and control approach actually has really helped shape that ecosystem and really helped guide that, right? And I think that's been one of the strong effects on Solana. And of course, greater community building, great running events, and a lot of people building on top of it. So yeah, we're long-term bullish on Solana. And of course, with what Republic is doing with our shares as well, it just demonstrates how Solana is really sort of wanting to prove and build itself out in this sort of thematic of theirs, which is internet capital markets.
Yeah, absolutely. We could go on, talk about so many things forever. The producer's telling us to wrap up right now, but real quickly, just what is, one takeaway you want people to have about, just kind of the future of crypto or from this conversation?
Well, I think first, we're so incredibly early, right? And I think a very simple way to think about that is that, I think the next year, I think will be a big year for crypto. I think, the Clarity Act is going to be something that will create mass tokenization across the board. And I think that's going to be something that we all have to be ready. And in my general lens, I tell people, tokenize or die, right? Yeah. The competitor who's going to tokenize, register your business, is going to win over the company that doesn't tokenize. And I think to me, that has been true across time. If you were discoverable on Google more than the other, the person who was discovered on Google will win. Whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Facebook, whether it's social, whether it's AI, and now it's tokens.
Been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you obviously like this video enough that you've got to the end. That's quite a big task. But listen, do me a favor, hit the like and subscribe button, and also check out what video's next, because I think you'll love it. But if you want even more, and when I'm talking more, I'm talking about member-generated ideas, incredible alpha, research, everything there to help you in your journey. Just head to realvision.com/join for the best financial intelligence out there and the pure alpha that's within the platform.